Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the GRIPS Forum. My name is Narushige Michita. I teach International Security Affairs at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS. I'll be serving you as your host today. We know that gender parity is very important. If there is gender parity, we would be happier, not only women, but also men. If there is gender parity, politics would be better because women and men working more closely together would definitely be able to do a better job than separately. If there is gender parity, our economies and societies would thrive. Developing and deploying 1/2 of the world's available talent has a huge bearing on the growth, competitiveness, and future readiness of economies and businesses worldwide. So that is the theory, and we know it. But in the real world, none of us will see gender parity in our lifetimes, according to the Global Gender Gap Report 2020, published by the World Economic Forum. The report revealed that gender parity would not be obtained for 99.5 years. Some countries are doing better than others, according to the report. Japan's gender gap is by far the largest among all advanced economies. The country ranks 121st out of 153 countries on the Global Gender Gap Index. In Japan, only 15% of senior and leadership positions are held by women, whose income is around half that of men. At 10%, female representation in the Japanese parliament is one of the lowest in the world. In the same report, Mexico reached the 25th position, becoming one of the most improved countries in 2019. The number of women in ministerial positions jumped from 15.8% in the previous year to 42.1%. Mexico has almost completely closed both in its educational attainment and health and survival gaps. What made it possible for Mexico to improve so much? What can we learn from Mexico's experience? Today, we have invited Mexican ambassador to Japan, Her Excellency Ms. Melba, PRÍA, to answer these questions. Ambassador PRÍA arrived in Japan as ambassador in 2019. Previously, she served as ambassador to India and to Indonesia. She was born in Mexico City and holds a BA in sociology, 2 MAs in public policy and international studies, and a postgraduate in national security and strategic studies. I will ask Ambassador PRÍA to make a presentation first, and we will open the screen for Q&A and discussion after that. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador PRÍA.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to GRIPS. Professor, thank you very much for the introduction. I will try to keep you entertained and tell you a few things about Mexico. We have a presentation that we are going to put on the screen, if you allow us. Give me 1 second. La primera, ¿no? Porque esta es como la 7. No, esta es la 7. Oh, la que sigue, ¿no? De una vez. Let me tell you a little bit about Mexico. We are more or less the same amount of people than Japan. 121 million people live in Mexico. Of course, we have a very big diaspora, but 122 million people live in Mexico. 52% out of those are women. 79% of all of the Mexicans live in urban areas. And as you can see, we have a very big indigenous community. We have 13% of the Mexican people speaking another language besides Spanish, of course, and being and allowing themselves to be called indigenous communities. We are the second most populated country in Latin America. We are the second economy in the world, the 14th economy in the world, the second in Latin America, the 14th economy in the world. And currently, it is very interesting what happens to our young women. 86% attend the basic education and 67% receive higher education. More or less half of the graduates in university are women, but only 8% of these women focus on what we call science-related specialties compared to the almost 30% of men that are doing this. To talk about gender equality, it is very important for me to understand the progresses in two categories, especially initially the formal equality. These that Professor was talking about, what we did and how we did it, to understand what formal equality is and the progress that has been done in the institutional framework for us to know what that formal equality is. The other one is the substantial equality. That has more to do with the socioeconomic reality of Mexico, the behavior of the communities, of families. How does a society like the Mexican one work with substantial equality? Ponme en mí. Tengo al señor Narushike eso. So let me talk a little bit about formal equality, as I said before. 1953. Many of us that are on the screen, we weren't even born in 1953. But in 1953 was the first time that Mexican women were allowed to vote. If you look at the history, in the case of Japan, it was 1946. So in a way, Japan was there before Mexican women were allowed to vote. We had a very important feminist movement starting in 1971, like everywhere in the world. We have had different waves of feminist movements. We were the first country to have the first Women World Conference on Women of the UN. And the Convention in the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women was signed by Mexico in 1981. In 1964, just 1 year after the females were allowed to vote, we had the first parliamentarian. She was called Aurora Jimenez. She was from Baja California in the northern part of Mexico. We had the first female ambassador in 1962, Paula Alegría. We all see her as one of our founding mothers of the women in the diplomatic corps. We are all very, how can I say, proud of her and how important she was. We had the first female governor in 1979, Griselda Álvarez, who was also later also an ambassador, and she was born in Colima. Formal equality. As I said before, women in development in 1980. In 1975, we hosted the first World Conference on Women. In 1980, the government created a national program to involve women in development, PRONAM. In a way, that program aimed to have women promoting initiatives towards an enhancement of our social condition. In 1981, and as I said before, we ratified CEDAW, which is very important convention against all elimination of all forms of discrimination about women. In 1984, again, the Mexican government created a program that was the development program and a development community with participation of women, and that provided lots of supports and programs and all sorts of things, and how women were agents of change in the community. And here, let me stop for a minute and say, what does it mean when we say agents of change? Imagine a rural community in the middle of Mexico in the 1980s. The school is somehow being promoted by women because it is their children that go to school. It is a small community that still doesn't have a clinic. So it is the women that go to the government, to the local government, as small as it might be, and say, we need a clinic because our children are getting sick. And the next clinic is 5 kilometers down the road. So this is what we mean by women agents of change in the communities. It is always development in small communities that are promoted by women. Again, the government created a program that was called Women in Solidarity around the 1990s. It was a whole sort of revolution in social development and in holistic development that put women and gender approach in the center of it. So that you have an idea, the grandmother of that program said that young women needed to have scholarships to go to school, and those scholarships had anything between 20 and 30% more money for young girls and young women to stay in school. Because in traditional communities like in Mexico or in Japan, the idea, well, not in Japan, but the idea in Mexico is that sometimes young girls stay at home and help at home. So the idea of these scholarship programs was to give families more money for the girls to stay in school. Again, this was like the institutional framework, and I will come back to the institutional framework in a little while. But what was important also in the reforms that the laws and the constitution needed to have for women to have representation. In 1996, we had an electoral quota of 70-30. So what does that mean? That at least 30% of every representative that the parties put forward had to be women. What happened then? We had an enormous or an important growth of women coming to the representation. Initially, many parties had done it before, but now it was a law. And what happened is that I was a representative, but in Mexico, you always have a second representative if something were to happen to you. So suddenly the women got all sick or something happened to them, and it was the men that came to it. So in 2002, the women started working, regardless of their party, to ways to enforce the quota. So it was very important to enforce the quota. In 2009, a new electoral law was voted in, and it was 60-40. Again, it was very important. Everybody had to spend, every party had to spend at least 2% of their budget for women. Then we had a budget with gender approach. Every budget everywhere in the country had to have a gender approach. And in 2014, again, the parliamentarians put their heads together and there was a quota for 50-50. What does that mean? My party, the yellow party, the orange party, the blue party, the red party, the whatever color party, in order to subscribe the list of candidates to any position, had to have 50% women, 50% men. In anything. I cannot put in my list if I didn't have 50-50. Then, of course, it happens that democracy does whatever it needs to do. Sometimes there are more women elected and sometimes there are more men elected. But at least the list has to be 50-50. So that you have an idea, 2018, and I will talk about the parliament a little later, we have what we call an equal parity in both, in Mexico as in Japan. We have the upper house and the lower house. In 2019, the parliamentarians went even further, and they said that all of the three branches of government have to have these constitutional reform and had to have gender parity in all of the ministries, in the Supreme Court and everything. So where are we now today? This is a picture of the lower house where you can see all of the parliamentarians in the lower house. In the lower house, we have 48% of parliamentarians that are women, and we have 49 parliamentarians, 49% of all parliamentarians, all senators that are women. So the Congress is really, they call themselves the Parliament of Parity. And it has been very interesting to see what has happened. 7 out of 16 ministers in the federal cabinet are women. In the Supreme Court, still a lot of things that we have to do to grow there, because only 2 out of 11 judges are women. Now, what happens in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? In the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, almost 30% of the ambassadors are women, but more than 45% of all participants in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are women. Now, let me go again a little bit about the institutions that were created. Again, in Mujeres, the National Institute for Women was created and coordinates the agreements between the different levels of authorities to promote policies and actions to make sure that every policy, action, and plan are mandatory for the strengthening of the gender perspective in every fund, in every policy, in everywhere. Then we have the National Commission to Prevent and Eradicate the Violence Against Women. And again, this institution promotes the observation of every international obligation related to prevention and sanction when there is a case of violence against women. We have the national system of prevention and sanction or eradication about violence against women. So again and again and again, we have all of the policies that are there to make sure that women have the same opportunities than men, and that there is no possibility of violence or discrimination. In last year, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs created something that is called the Feminist Foreign Policy, which aims to have a widespread program of inclusion, of equalitarian access, and the human rights of women as the right of women as human rights. So again, let me go to the feminist theories. After the World War II, what women wanted is not the masculine concept of privilege, power, war, deterrent, threat. What women wanted is cooperation, justice, order, and how to incorporate the multi-dimensional approach of every public policy. So the feminist foreign policy is a set of principles from the foreign ministry and from the foreign policy that want to orient and governing actions to decrease the structural gaps between gender inequalities, and how initially we become a more prosperous society in Mexico, but then again, how can we help the world create a prosperous society for us all? So 5 pillars are the ones that lead these policy in Mexico: international leadership on gender issues, institutional improvement of egalitarian development, elimination of anything that has to do with gender violence. And I will come back to the violence in Mexico. How do you make visible the immense capital that female represent in our ministry, but in every ministry? And how can we complement with other global actions? It is precisely regarding diplomats that we always have a problem, because we have many Mexican women in diplomacy. We have had 3 female foreign ministers, Rosario Green in 1998, Patricia Espinosa in 2006, and Claudia Ruiz Massieu in 2015. We have had incredible women in international organizations. Amalia Gonzalez, she was the vice chair of the Inter-American Commission of Women. Rosario Green was the undersecretary of the United Nations. Carmen Moreno was the executive secretary of the Inter-American Commission for Women and director of the International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women. We have Claudia Romo, the chief advocate of UNICEF. We have Alicia Bárcenas as the Secretary of UN for Latin America and the Caribbean. And Patricia Espinosa, who was our foreign minister, is today the executive secretary of the United Nations Framework on the Convention of Climate Change. So despite all of these great women and so many others, these examples in our diplomacy, today it is still us, the women, that in some way or another have to face the dilemma of personal or professional life. And it is, again, the women that every now and then have to say family first and career later. So any institution should work to make possibility that the human resources and that we women and you men have the same opportunities and don't face these dilemmas. Now, let's talk a little bit about the quote unquote private sector. Mexico has an interesting labor force. And when we call labor force, we don't mean that when we say labor force, it's actually the amount of people that work and are paid to work, because everybody works. So we have a labor force in which formally we have almost half of the women working in that labor force. 82% out of that labor force is men. So out of the 100% of women, half of them work and get paid for it. Out of the 100% of men, 82% work and get paid for it. So it is still an important gap there. The gap wages, even if it is unconstitutional and against the law, there is a gap wage, anything up to 18%. Now, because of the way the labor force is structured in Mexico, we have an important, what you would call informal workforce. What does that mean? It is a very important part of the workforce that is not employed, that is somehow self-employed, or that it has informal relation with the way they make money. That is, I have a little card, and with my little card, I sell tacos or hot dogs or something. I sell peanuts or something like that. So out of that informal workforce, 60% of them are are women. And that is a very important number, because usually informal workshop means that you have no social security and that you have a low participation and, in a way, sometimes unpaid work burden. But what happens to the other women that work anyway, that are not in the informal workshop and that are not in the formal labor force? Well, like in many countries in the world, or I would say like in every country in the world, there is a lot of unpaid work that is done by women, and most of those burdens are borne by women. So taking care of the household, taking care of ailing parents, taking care of the community, that all somehow stops you from devoting time for formal work. We had a survey in 2018, and that survey say that 30% of women are heads of families. That means that a third of every family has only the mother in charge of that family. And that is a very complicated reality for for women. Women represent, as we said before, 50% of the university graduates, but 30% of the entry-level posts and 10% of the executive committee position, but only 8% of the CEOs. So while both gender aspire has reached an important advancement in Mexico, men are 88% times more likely to be senior manager positions than women, still in a country like Mexico that has done so well in many other things. Now, let's talk about the other reality, the substantial equality. When I say substantial equality, and we were talking about it a little before, is what happens in the society. So the legal framework is there. As we said, half of the parliamentarians are women. Half of the ministers are women. But what happens in our society? So we also have a very unusual work culture of many hours in the office, not because we stay longer, but because we take very long lunch breaks. So it's a very unusual culture. But what happens to women when they have to go home and tend to their children and to their families? So there is a problem that only 66% of the women really involved in employment, education, and training, because they have to stay longer in the office. So there is always that area of the society that puts women backwards, even if the laws and the legal framework is there. For example, in Mexico, paternity leave, although very much paraded and important if we talk about parental leave, actually in the law it says that parental leave for men is only 5 days, whilst parental leave for women when they had a baby is 90 days. So you have an important issue there. How much do we promote women to be scientists? And why do we insist in women to be scientists? If you look at the EU, it says that if you promote women in scientific activities, it will go, your per capita, your GDP per capita will go up 3%. So it is an issue of women being able to be up there if we don't do anything for the substantial equality. And when I say substantial equality, let me talk a little bit about, for example, the perceptions. No, I think I put it somewhere else. Okay. What happened in COVID, for example? 29% of the mothers are heads of households, as I said before. A third of every household in Mexico is taken care of only by women. In the case of COVID, 85% out of all nurses in Mexico are women. So imagine what happened to the households in Mexico when 85% of the nurses are women. 40% of the households are working mothers. So again, 30% of mothers are heads of household. 85% of the nurses are women. 37% of the women are working mothers. And we had 10% of pregnant women mortality rate around everything that had to do with COVID. So it is the burden of COVID-19 was on the women, is still on the women. And that creates a lot of issues in a family. Again, let me say something about the gender equality in Mexico. Again, when we talk about the legal framework, we have legal equality. We have recognition of women being part of civil and political rights. We have ratified every international treaty under the sun on women's rights. We have awareness on women's issue. We have public policy, regulation, legislation, institutions, everything that has to do with women. We have the enforcement of discrimination. We have the adoption and adoption of positive actions. But what is the real hindrance for women? There is a statistic somewhere that I don't have at the moment, that 85% of the women thought that they had some sort of violence. We had a very interesting workshop here at the embassy on the day of Women's Day in March. And we asked the people, especially, I mean, we were sitting male, female, male, female, male, female. And it was very interesting to see what women regard as violence. Imagine that 85% of women, we declare that we have had some sort of abuse or violence, and 63% of women when they are over 15. What does it mean, abuse or violence? A look, a touch, a comment by a family member that says, why are you wearing what you're wearing? Something in school that has to do with women's issues, that I, as a daughter, I'm asked to do things that my male brother doesn't do. So all of that is abuse for women. And societies are still there in not allowing women to develop as equal rights with their peers, with their male peers. So we have developed incredible framework for all of these. But then when we have to go back to the habits and stereotypes, there is a problem in every household or in every woman. For example, we talk about patriarchal societies. Is patriarchal society only an issue of men? Is it only this idea that patriarchal comes from pater, comes from father? But are we reproducing the patriarchal society, even as women? A patriarchal society doesn't only have to do with the hierarchy that we give to men, but it's also a mindset. It's a mindset of men that promote these stereotypes, and it's a mindset of women that allow the stereotypes to happen. When women come to the workforce, they dress like men because that's, in a way, how you're expected to dress. And if you have a dress that is too loud, people look at you and say, maybe they don't say anything, but it's just the way sometimes they look at you. So all of those issues of abuse and all of those realities of stereotypes that we have in societies somehow at times overshine the realities of such a robust framework of policies, of actions, of anything else. Many of you, of course, have heard about a terrible problem that we have in Mexico that are feminicides. So you say, why in a society like the Mexican society, where more or less, as a professor was saying, we are in the very big 25th place in the world, which is not a bad place to have when you are 200 countries in the world. Why do we have this incredible problem where women, young women, are disappeared and they just disappear? Or, of course, they are killed. It has to do with a society that is deeply machista. I mean, we created the word, which is not a nice word to have, but it is this patriarchal society taken to the extreme. And we allow society to, well, it's not that we allow it in the legal framework, but in a way, our girls, our women are in that possibility of being kidnapped or killed or anything. I'm not saying that this happens every day and it happens to every woman in Mexico, but it does happen. It is a reality. So even in a society like the Mexican one, where we have all of the legal framework, all of the participation of men and women helping the visibility of women in important places, and we have signed every treaty around women's rights, we still have a problem on the visibility of men and women and how to balance the role that women and men have. I am always surprised that we talk about programs that should be somehow mentoring programs for women, but we also need mentoring programs for men. What does this new masculinity define, and what does it mean for a man to be a man? It sounds maybe a little controversial, but it is a reality. The other day I was talking to somebody who is a specialist in gender issues, and she said, let's for a minute think that I have a son, for example, and I have done everything possible so that he doesn't have to do anything around the house. He's been pampered by his mother, pampered by his grandmother. He is the only child in a household. He is everything and he is allowed everything. And then when he arrives to a workplace, from being the king, we expect him to understand that men and women have the same equal rights. And all he has seen in his house was his mother working on everything and for everything so that he could have everything that he needed. And then we expect him to understand that women and men are the same when he hasn't even seen it. He doesn't have that experience. So the mentoring programs for women are also mentoring programs for men. Men have to be part of the mentoring programs for women, and women have to be part of the mentoring programs for men. We have a very confusing society because we are always somehow pushed in two directions about this is what the legal framework says, and the legal framework is very clear. We're all the same, and we shouldn't allow any differences between men and women. But then we have societies that still have these recurrent issues in which men and women are not the same. So it is for us to decide what types of societies we want, not only for today, but for the future. For sure, the legal framework is important. It is the first step around changing a society. But then again, the society is for sure the most important changes that we need to see in the world happening. So as a matter of conclusion, let me go again to the landmarks for gender equality that we have had in Mexico. As Professor was saying, there are, I would say, 8 very important landmarks in these. Everywhere, any legislation, we have legal equality between men and women. And when I say legal equality, I also mean that women can marry other women, that women have the right in Mexico City to have an abortion. So we are legally equal, but then there are issues that women have also as a legal right that maybe men don't have, like in the case of Mexico City and abortion. So the recognition that we are not only civil, but also political agents, and we have all civil and political rights. We are allowed to vote, we are allowed to be voted, we are allowed to be part of a party or any possibility to have our rights there. In Mexico, 18 years old, you are an adult, legal adult, and you are allowed to marry at 16 if your parents allow it. You have a driving license. You have a driving license at 18, and if your parents allow it, you also have again a driving license at 16. We never lose our name, never. I was born Melba PRÍA, and I will die Melba PRÍA. In the meantime, I married 1 or 5 times. And in the meantime, I had 1 or many children. I will always be Melba PRÍA. So we keep the right to our own name. And it is very important that women have their own identity, legal and political rights as civil and political agents of the society. Of course, Mexico has ratified all of the international treaties on women's rights. The awareness on women's issues are there. The public policies, the institutions, the legislation have to be made with a gender perspective. And all of the institutions have to be there to acknowledge that women have legal equality and that we recognize women with civil and political rights. Of course, the enforcement in any case of discrimination or violence against women and the adoption of positive actions, mainly in the electoral normality. As I said before, you cannot, as a political party, inscribe any of your lists if 50% of your candidates are not women and 50% of your candidates are men. So we have made incredible progress if we regard the formal equality. The last 40 years have seen incredible changes. I would even say the last 60 years, but incredible changes to a more balanced reality. You know, maybe my father, I don't know if he changed my diapers, but today, parents, fathers, always change diapers. There is no such thing as a young man not changing the diaper of his or her child. And before that was like not really there. So we still have to work on the substantial equality, and that substantial equality has to be achieved somehow by sustainable socioeconomic behavior from the community, and again and again and again putting forward that if we want legislation to be a legislation that is fruitful, we also have to change the society in which this legislation is put forward. I know I went maybe a little too fast with my presentation, but that will give us a little more time for your comments and maybe questions about the Mexican agenda for equality of men and women. I do thank you very much.